Okay, so let's get started. Thank you all for taking our time and joining the session today. My name is Roshan. I work as a solution architect with Ingram Micro Australia. I'm based in Melbourne. I have my email address displayed on the screen, so if you have any questions on Azure or Windows Virtual Desktop, you can feel free to get in touch with me. Before we get into the details of the session, if you are unable to hear me, please let us know on the Teams chat. John, Sam, can you confirm if you're able to hear me clearly?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful.
Yep, I hear you perfectly loud and clear.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. For the rest of the folks, I would request you to kindly put your microphone on mute so that we don't get any background noises. If you have any questions, please use the Teams chat. As always, I'll go ahead and address most of the questions during the end of the session. Today we have a lot of content to cover, a lot of demo to cover. So today's session is on implementing Windows Virtual Desktop using Azure Active Directory Domain Services as the authentication source, and we'll be using Azure File Storage as the storage for our user profile containers. In the previous session, we saw how we can use a traditional Active Directory running on a Windows virtual machine and a file server on a Windows virtual machine as a combination to implement Windows Virtual Desktop. Today we are using a lot of services which is inbuilt within Azure or are available as a service within Azure. And we'll look how we can implement Windows Virtual Desktop using this. These are two different options which we could use. Both of them have their own pros and cons. We'll also look at those pros and cons today. Before I go ahead, let's look at the quick agenda. So just to make sure everybody is on the same page, we'll have a quick introduction about Windows Virtual Desktop. We'll look at Active Directory options and pros and cons of using Azure Active Directory domain services. Then we'll look at what is Azure File Storage, its pros and cons. I also want to quickly run through the promotion that Ingram Micro is running. We have already got a very good response for this promotion, so I wanted to make sure everybody is aware of it, as it is limited and time bound. So we'll go through the promotion and we'll also look at some pricing details. Then I'll show you the lab setup, which I've or a lab diagram which I've used to set up my Azure for this particular demonstration. I'll also show you how you can set up a hybrid Active Directory using Azure Active Directory Domain Services. And one of the questions that I got via email is we would like to know what is the next session about. So I'll definitely let you know what the next session, which is the next Wednesday that we're talking about. And I'd appreciate if you could join to the session as well. And at the end, we'll look at question and answers. So this is what the overall agenda looks like. Again, at any point of time, if you have any questions, feel free to post them on the chat. So Windows Virtual Desktop was introduced sometime around September last year. It's a desktop as a service offering from Microsoft. It is the only Windows 10 multi-session offering available in today's market. Citrix and VMware Horizon actually are using Windows Virtual Desktop in the background to provide you a multi-session Windows 10 experience. It's not available on IBM Cloud. It's not available on AWS. It's only available on Azure as of today. It's very much optimized for Office 365 Pro Plus. What I mean by that is you can synchronize your OneDrive, you can synchronize your Outlook, you can use all the Word, Excel, PowerPoint applications, and all this data is not being stored on the C drive. It gets stored on another container or another location using the FSLogix technology. So it's very much optimized for Outlook and OneDrive. You can sync, you can do on-demand files, and everything works very seamlessly for an end user. For an end user, it's as simple as he's logging on to a Windows 10 machine and doing his day-to-day job. This is the only supported platform for Windows 7 if you want to continue and receive extended security updates. So if you have customers who have proprietary softwares which only run on Windows 7, After January 14th, Windows 7 has stopped getting security updates, which means your Windows 7 is not patched, which may or may not result in a hacking attack. So just to make sure your company is safe, your data is safe, I would definitely recommend moving on to Windows Virtual Desktop, or preferably upgrading to Windows 10 so that you can make use of all the technology and enhancement that Windows 10 has brought into itself. It is very tightly integrated with Microsoft 365. People who have attended previous session would know the license benefits that you get with Microsoft 365, but you can also use the advanced threat protection functionalities such as conditional access, multi-factor authentication, Active Directory auditing. You can use other functionalities of email security and identity security, such as premium privileged identity management. You can use all those features and functionalities on top of Windows Virtual Desktop if you combine Microsoft 365 with Windows Virtual Desktop. It gives you an option to deploy pooled or personal desktops. One of the questions that I got in the previous session was, when do you use personal desktops? One of the scenarios that I've seen with my experience is typically when we do a project, the CEO or the CIO gets a personal desktop and rest of the users get pooled desktop. Or if you have a scenario where you have a customer who have very heavy applications that they use, for example, things like AutoCAD, any design tools that use a lot of graphics or use a lot of resources. We preferably give such users who use these applications a personal desktop or a dedicated desktop, and rest of the users pooled desktop. All the options to deploy Windows Virtual Desktop is available within Azure portal itself. You don't need any third-party tools. It is simple to deploy and easy to scale. Quickly talking about the licenses, any customer who is using Microsoft 365 as of today is eligible to reuse the Windows license, which he gets as part of his Microsoft 365 with Windows Virtual Desktop. If you have a customer who is using Office 365, then first they have to purchase a Windows 10 subscription license and then use Azure or then use Windows Virtual Desktop. So I would definitely encourage and recommend partners to help their customer transition from Office 365 to Microsoft 365. And a couple of weeks ago, Microsoft actually renamed all the Office 365 plans to Microsoft 365. It's more of a name change, but I would definitely encourage everybody to move to Microsoft 365, E3, E5 or business plan so that you get the best benefit of productivity and you can reuse the license with Windows Virtual Desktop. If you come across a customer who still wants to use a server operating system as a session host on Windows Virtual Desktop, he can still do that. But with respect to RDS CALs, he will need to purchase RDS CALs with software assurance. Even though he has an on-prem RDS CAL for, let's say, 2016 or 2019, without software assurance, he cannot reuse that with Windows Virtual Desktop. He has to have an RDS CAL with software assurance, with an active software assurance. Well, let's go into the details of today's session. So for today's session, what are the Windows Virtual Desktop requirements? Of course, you need to have an active Azure subscription. You should be able to create resources within it. One of the important resources is a virtual network. You definitely need to have an Active Directory infrastructure. Windows Virtual Desktop does not work in a workgroup environment. It always has to communicate with an Active Directory infrastructure. And today, the Active Directory infrastructure that we'll be using is Azure Active Directory Domain Services or Managed Domain Services. The account permission for today's session is, or if you want to set up the way we are looking at today's session, is he has to be a member of a specific group called AAD, Azure Active Directory Domain Controller Administration Group. He also needs to be global administrator role or owner. What I found out from previous sessions, some of you also suggested that a contributor of the subscription would also work. The answer is yes. You can also be a contributor of the subscription, but you definitely have to be a global administrator while you're giving the consent. So you need a global admin permission. You also need a tenant creator permission on Windows Virtual Desktop application. I will go through all these roles and groups in the session, in the demonstration, so you get a more visual explanation of it. And in today's session, again, we are not using a service account. We are using a normal user account to configure Windows Virtual Desktop. And the account which you use to configure Windows Virtual Desktop cannot be enabled for multi-factor authentication. All right, so the MFA for this particular account is disabled. So let's look at Active Directory options. Like I said earlier, Windows Virtual Desktop definitely requires the users who log in cannot be a workgroup user. They have to be an Active Directory user. So with respect to Active Directory, we have two options, right? The one option is use traditional Windows Active Directory running on a virtual machine, run an Active Directory sync the users to Azure Active Directory, and then have the Windows Virtual Desktop communicate with the virtual machine, right? This is what we saw in the previous session. In today's session, we'll be looking at Active Directory Domain Services. So Active Directory Domain Services, in a way, is an extension of your traditional Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, I'm sorry. So Azure Active Directory Domain Services is an extension of Azure AD. So this is, you can call it as an add-on feature for your Azure Active Directory. This feature has to be enabled and configured. And once enabled and configured, domain services will allow you to join machines. It can be Windows 10 machines or Windows Server machines to join to your Azure Active Directory domain, right? So if you use a traditional Azure AD, you cannot join your machines to the traditional Azure AD. If you want to join the machines to traditional Azure AD, or if you want users who are present in Azure AD to be able to log in to the virtual machines, then you need to enable domain services. This is a feature that is not enabled by default. You have to enable it, and you can have only one domain services per tenant, right? If you have, let's say, 4 or 5 domains registered in a tenant, you can enable domain services only for one domain in that particular tenant or in that particular directory, right? So keeping that in mind, so let's look at what are the pros and cons. How does it compare with a traditional Active Directory which runs on a virtual machine or which is running on-prem, right? So pros, it is very, very simple and easy to deploy. It gives you a user interface wizard. You just use that wizard, fill in the information, and it gets deployed. Very less human intervention when it comes to deployment of it. It takes away a lot of management of your Active Directory, like patching, updating, making sure it's highly available. All of these things is managed and maintained by Microsoft because it's a managed directory service. So you don't need to worry about making sure it is always up and running, making sure it is, there are schedules within Azure itself which can back it up automatically. You don't need to worry about its high availability. So all of those things are taken care of. One of the other very important benefit, which I see for smaller customers who do not have a very good firewall in place or do not have a very strong on-prem infrastructure, is you do not need to have a site-to-site VPN or express route configured in order to use Azure Active Directory domain services, right? All you need to do is have your users present in Azure Active Directory. That's your goal. So once your users are present in Azure Active Directory, then if you enable domain services, they can start logging on to virtual machines, Windows Virtual Desktop, and start using it with the username and password, which is available in Azure AD. What are the disadvantages? Now, there's a lot of rumor that says Azure Active Directory Domain Services does not support group policy. The answer is no. It definitely supports group policies, but what it does not support is the replication from on-prem to Azure. So if you have created group policies in your local Active Directory, you cannot replicate that to domain services. You will have to recreate those group policies in domain services, right? Currently, the domain and forest trust is not supported. This is already in the roadmap. This is under development. As I said earlier, you can have only one domain services per tenant, right? So sometimes this becomes a limitation. If you want to enable multiple domain services for multiple of your domains within a single tenant, it's, as of today, it's not possible. So it becomes very tricky to set it up. Also, if you would like to extend your domain services outside the virtual network it is configured, it starts adding complexity. You need to configure VNet to VNet peering and then make sure the authentication and the traffic is flowing through. So it becomes a little complicated when you try to extend the virtual network, or if you have a scenario where you need to have multiple domain services as part of your tenant. The other, I wouldn't say a drawback, but this is by design, is Azure AD replication to domain services is a one-way replication, right? For example, you cannot have a replication where you create or you enable a feature in your domain services, it writes back to your Azure AD, and then again it writes back to your on-prem Active Directory. That is not available as of today, right? It's a one-way replication. If you create a user in your Active Directory and have AD sync, then it creates the user in Azure AD, and that can be then given permissions via domain services to virtual machines. But the other way around is not possible. So I hope it's not too confusing. At a very high level, what you need to remember is domain services is Active Directory as a service running in Azure, right? It's an Active Directory as a service running in Azure, using which you can join machines to the domain. You don't need to manage and maintain your Active Directory within Azure. If you run this, all the patching and updating of your Active Directory is taken care by Microsoft. So that is the authentication piece. Let's look at Azure File Storage. Within Azure, there are broadly 4 different types of storages. There is disks, which is primarily used for your VHDs. There is queues and tables, which is primarily used for your SaaS-based applications. And there is files. Files is a type of storage which can be accessed on the traditional SMB protocol, right? You can consider file storage as a big SAN or a big NAS that is available on Azure, and this SAN or NAS can be accessed by multiple machines at the same time, right? It's a shared storage. It's a fully managed file share that's available in cloud, which can be accessed whether by on-prem virtual machine, by on-premise machines or by Azure virtual machines, right? These shares, these storage, file storage, can directly be mounted on a Windows, Linux, or a Mac OS without the need of creating a virtual machine, attaching the storage to it, and then accessing it. This is a special type of storage where I just create the storage and directly mount it to my machine which has internet connection, right? So it acts as a shared storage available for us to use. Azure File Storage has its, again, pros and cons. It's a fully managed service similar to domain services. The storage is managed and maintained by Microsoft. You don't need to carry any overhead in terms of its availability. It's a shared access, which means it uses traditional SMB 2.0 and 3.0 protocol. 2.0 can only be used within Azure. 3.0 is what is available within and outside Azure. If you have applications that need shared storage, then Azure File Storage is the storage to use. And redundancy, it provides you 9 nines redundancy, so your data accidental deletion by the system is very, very minimal. Your data is always available for you to use. There are some disadvantages that it carries. If you're using Azure Backup to take backup of your Azure file storage, then the maximum number of times that you can take a backup of your Azure file storage is 4 times in a day, right? For small to medium customers, this might be sufficient, but if you look at medium to large customers, they would like to have more and more backup taken. It may be one per hour or 6 times a day or 8 times a day. These functionalities are still under development. As of today, the maximum number of backups that you can take per day is 4 for the Azure file storage. And this is with respect to Azure Backup, right? I'm not really aware if there are third-party tools that have already integrated with Azure file storage. I know they have integrated with blob storage, but I'm not really sure if you have Veeam or Veritas or Commvault that can take backup of Azure file storage for more number of times than what Azure Backup can do. Deleting snapshots, you have to be very, very careful about it, especially when you're taking backup on Azure Backup. There are times that recovery would fail, and deleting file shares that are protected by Azure Backup also might lead to data loss. So when it comes to backup and restore of Azure file storage, you have to be very careful and very cautious. But apart from that, it's a beautiful service. I'll show you how to create it, how do you give permissions, how do you access it, and you can see how easy it is to configure. So this is my lab setup for today. As you can see, I don't have an on-prem Active Directory in my lab setup. I've directly created users on my Azure Active Directory, and I've just extended that to an Azure Active Directory domain services. The domain services has its own network. Inside this network, you have Azure File Storage and Azure Windows Virtual Desktop Session Host. I'd request all the attendees to kindly be on mute so that we avoid any background noises. Hybrid deployment looks something like this. So if you do have an on-prem Active Directory, you can still use that with the setup that I have. So all you need to do is extend your on-prem Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. You can sync the users using AD Connect and then extend it to domain services. Right. So let's say if you have a customer who still wants to continue to use his on-prem Active Directory for some of his applications, right, legacy applications on-prem, and or he wants to still maintain a simple Active Directory on-prem, the entire setup is still very much possible. All you need to do is an extra step of just extending it to Azure Active Directory. The promotion that we are running, we are actually running a promotion. We already have about 3 to 4 partners who have qualified for this. So we have $1,000 Azure credit for any Windows Virtual Desktop opportunity, can be used for POC or for production environment. So if you have a customer whom you think Windows Virtual Desktop is a good fit, let's get on a call, discuss, let's have a conference call with the customer. Let's see when does he want to implement it, how soon does he want to implement it. During these times, making sure you have remote working environment available for all your customers is very critical, and Windows Virtual Desktop definitely fits well to that requirement. It's available for the first 10 partners who come with an Azure, with an active Windows Virtual Desktop opportunity. We have about $10,000 worth of credit available with us. So I'd like to distribute it across 10 partners. So if you do have an opportunity, please do get in touch with us. Now for the pricing information, a lot of people asked in the previous session about, can you give us pricing information? Now for pricing information, I would request you to get in touch with your regional account managers. So we have cloud BDMs spread across Australia. We have Sam in Queensland. We have Susanna for ACT and New South Wales. We have Kimberly for Victoria, and we have Fabiano for Western Australia. So I'll be sharing the slides by the end of today's session. I'll put the slides on the chat so you can download the slides. They have put in their email addresses and their phone numbers. For any pricing information, any opportunity that you have, these are your point of contacts. I would very much appreciate if you get in touch with them. They will help you smoothly transition and making sure a subscription is created and you get the credits for your production or POC environment. So With that in mind, these are the overall deployment steps. I'll not go through all of them in detail. We'll quickly jump on to the demonstration and go through each of these steps. Now, in the demo, there are multiple subscriptions that I'm using. The reason, as I said, is I've already enabled domain services in one of my subscription or in one of my tenant, and I cannot re-enable it. And in order to deploy domain services, it takes roughly about 35 to 40 minutes. So hence, in one subscription, I already have it running. I'll have a brand new subscription in which I'll show you how to configure a domain services. Okay, so let's get started. Sam, Kim, can you confirm if you're able to see the screen sharing?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. So this is one of my subscriptions. It's a brand new subscription I've created using my personal account. And here, in order to enable domain services, so it's available under services. So if you just search for Active Directory domain services, you will be able to Active Directory domain. Right. So here you find that option. Now, of course, before you actually go ahead and configure it, what I would always recommend is register your domain, right? If it is contoso.com, what's your customer domain, then register the domain first so that you can extend that domain into domain services. Since it's a testing environment, what I have here is I have a domain by the name with .onmicrosoft.com. So I'll be using the same domain to extend it to domain services. Let's give it a minute. Okay, so this is my domain, roshanyella.outlook.onmicrosoft.com, right? So using the same domain, I'll go ahead and extend it. Let me go back to my home screen. Click on domain services, say add. Now this process, what I'm showing you right now, is already configured on another domain name in another subscription, which I'll jump onto after showing you how to configure this, right? I wanted to cover as many steps as possible in the demonstration, hence I'm using multiple subscriptions. So I'll use an existing work group. This is my domain DNS name. So DNS name has to be, you can definitely give it a prefix, right? Now, do remember that once you configure your domain services, this DNS name cannot be changed, right? Once configured. If you want to change it, you'll have to basically delete your domain services as a whole and then recreate it using a different DNS name. So it's very important that you give the right DNS name to begin with. I'll use the region Southeast Asia. I'll select this queue. Standard queue is sufficient. Now the difference between standard, premium, and enterprise is primarily the number of users that you can have. A standard gives you approximately about 3,000 authentications. So you don't need to worry if you have less than 3,000 users. Just go with standard. I'll use user forest type for now. Click next. It definitely needs a network. So this is the network into which you will add your virtual machines so that they can join your domain services, right? So make sure you choose the right network and add your machines into this network so that later they can authenticate and join to the domain which you are currently configuring. So one of the very important groups that get created is AADDS administrator. So think of it as the local administrators group in your Active Directory, right? So this is the group that has the admin privileges in your domain services. For example, if you want to add a machine to the domain, remove the machine from the domain, this is the group, or a member of this group can do that, right? So what it is doing right now is adding my existing group, the user which I've logged into, part of this particular group. Synchronize. Now, as I said, this is an extension of your Azure AD, right? Now, in your Azure AD, if you have created multiple groups, if you have created multiple users and you want to scope, or you want to make this domain services available only to certain groups of your Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, then you can scope it. You can say scope and then select the groups. If you want everybody who are part of your Azure AD to use domain services, then just leave it to all. So then you just review, and once I hit create, this creation roughly takes about 30 to 35 minutes, right? So I've initiated the creation of it in my new subscription. So hopefully by the end of the session, this should be created, and we'll come back and see what options it shows. But keeping the time frame in mind, what I've done is this is another subscription that I have. And here I already have a domain called as cloudme.live, right? And I've already gone ahead and configured the domain services. So whatever you saw till now, those steps have been run, and this is the end result of it, right? So this is what it looks like. You have your Active Directory up and running. You can look at some of its properties. It has a network. This is the network, and these are the IP addresses. Now, these are the two IP addresses in which your DNS will also be running. So think of it as an Active Directory, but you do not have access to the Windows level of it, right? You cannot log into this domain services Active Directory, right? It gives you all the options to create, manage right from the Azure portal itself. So this is the end result of it. So I have a domain called cloudme.live. It has been configured with domain services, right? So next, what we'll do is we'll quickly jump on to making sure we have the right user permissions, and then we'll start off with Windows Virtual Desktop creation, right? So the authentication piece is taken care. What I want to make sure is I go on to my Active Directory, go to the groups, and show you the new group that gets created. AADDC administrators. So this is the group that gets created, AADDC group. And in this group, I have a new member called as Iron Man, right? So this is the user that I'll be using today, who would act as my administrator, who is part of my DC administrators group. If you also look at the roles assigned to it, he's also a global administrator, and he also has owner permission on my subscription, right? So this is the user that we'll be using. And of course, this user doesn't have multi-factor authentication configured for him. I have a couple of other users as well. I quickly want to show those users to you who will be part of this particular demonstration. I've created a group called as WVD users. And in this group, I have two more users who would be acting as a normal user. So that's Thor and Hulk. So Iron Man is the administrator. Thor and Hulk are normal users who are part of Avengers company, who will be part of our session today. Great. So once the user permission is taken care, what we need to do next is the same steps that we did last time. The very first thing that we need to do in order to use Windows Virtual Desktop is give consent to the service saying that this is the subscription that will have Windows Virtual Desktop running. So, and for that you need Active Directory or tenant ID or directory ID. So I'll use that. Go to this particular page, enter it here, submit for server app, and I log in as Iron Man. I'll say allow, so you can, so the service can read this my user details, and log in again, this time as a client app. And this is for the WVD client that we would be using. I'll again log in as Iron Man. Now you will be able to accept and get this information only if you are a domain administrator, right? Else it will actually ask you to log in back as an administrator or who has the right permission. So it's very important that you are a global administrator if you want to do this. So once this is done, the next step is to give Iron Man tenant creator permission. So if I go back to my Active Directory, go to my Windows Virtual Desktop and users and group, you will see Iron Man already has the tenant creator permission, right? In your scenario, if he doesn't have it, then just click on add user, select the user here, say Iron Man or whoever is the administrator, hit select and hit assign. Now, if I hit assign right now, it will throw an error saying this user already has this permission, but in your scenario, if he doesn't, then make sure you do the step, right? This permission will give him rights to create new Windows Virtual Desktop tenants, right? So only a user who has permissions, who has tenant creator permissions on the Windows Virtual Desktop application can create new Windows Virtual Desktop tenants. So in my scenario, he already has that, so I'll not redo the step. Now, once the tenant permission has been given and the permissions are all in place, we have to start running our PowerShell commands, right? The first command is to install the module for RD infrastructure. So let's go ahead and have this installed in our PowerShell. Say yes to all. I'll import the module and then I'll add the RDS account. So here again, which account do we use? We use Iron Man. Password. Oops. Okay. So now the account has been added. The very last thing that we need to do in PowerShell is to go ahead and create a new tenant. So for this, what I typically do is just search for new RDS tenant. You will get this option to run it from a user interface based option rather than typing out the entire GUID. So I've already copied my directory ID. I've already copied my subscription ID. What I'll do here is I'll just give it another name. I'll say WVD S2 demo. Okay. So basically what I'm doing is creating a new tenant in the subscription in the tenant ID with the name WVD session 2 or S2 demo. So I'll just run this. Now this command will typically throw an error if you have not assigned the tenant creator permission, right? So if you get an error here saying user is unable to query the management service, that's the typical error. Go back and check if you have the tenant creator permission assigned to this particular role. So in my scenario, I've taken care of it. So the tenant gets created. And now going back, we start creating the Windows Virtual Desktop within our Azure portal. Click create. We'll go ahead and use Azure ADDS WVD. The reason I'm using this is because this particular resource group actually has the Azure Active Directory domain services configured in it, right? So it makes it easy for me to select the network, select the region, things like this. So Southeast Asia, the desktop pool name. So we'll give ADDS desktop, or let me give it desktop session. We'll still go ahead with pooled. This is where you can select pooled or personal. So we'll go ahead with pooled and default desktop users. Now here you will actually need to add individual users by their UPN, right? Microsoft is still working on making sure that you can add groups here, but as of now, you will need to add the individual users one by one. So I've given these three users, right? Service metadata location, as explained in the first session, no PII data goes on to the service metadata. It is the only information that goes out as is the service metadata, is this subscription has Windows Virtual Desktop enabled, right? That's the only information that goes across. Availability set. So for now, I'll say no. I'll go with user profile light because it's a demo. I don't want to run hundreds of machines. I'll total users are 3 and desktop suffix. I will say use the same name so that it's easy for me to remember. Desktop session. Okay, desktop. Here, I'll again use the same image. There are different images available. I typically use multi-session with Office Pro Plus because it just takes out the work of installing Office again on the image. Here, I would use Ironman at cloudme.live. Give him. Also, one point to quickly note, this password has to be a minimum of 12 characters, right? I had a shorter password previously. When I reached the stage, it gave me an error saying the password is not supported. So make sure your administrator has a minimum of 12 characters with combination of special character and numbers and things like this. I'll choose the tenant. I'll choose the network. So here I have the network configured under my Azure Active Directory, and my network is the first one. So this network has my domain services configured, which in the background will also have my DNS configured so that I'll be able to join the machines to this domain. Right. So I click next. So the name which we created was WVD demo. This name has to be exactly the same, else you will see an error. So make sure whatever tenant you created, it matches. So validation is passed. If I go ahead and hit create, this will go ahead and create a new pooled Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure. So this particular phase of registering or giving a consent, giving tenant creator, creating a Windows Virtual Desktop session or host pool is the same steps that you do whether it is a traditional Active Directory or an Azure Active Directory domain services, right? These are the same steps. You don't change these steps. So I'll go ahead and hit create. Again, this takes roughly about 15 to 20 minutes to create. Again, keeping the time frame in mind, what I've done is I've already created another host pool, which we would use. But before I jump onto the host pool, what I want to show you is the file services or the file storage, right? Now, if you go to storage accounts, if you just search for storage accounts, you can go ahead and add a new storage account, right? So I'll just give it the same tenant. I'll give it a storage account named WVD demo. Okay, I'll choose the same region. Make sure everything is part of the same region. Do not spread across different regions. I'll use LRS. I don't really have a need for read-only access. I'll use all networks and I'll go ahead and create this. So I'm going ahead and basically creating a new storage account. Within a storage account, you can create either queues or queues or tables or disks or file storage, right? The first thing you have to do is create a storage account, right? That storage account gets created pretty quickly. It doesn't take too much time, hopefully. Also, while it's getting created, a quick update. We did talk about the promotion. The promotion is $1,000, which is Azure credit. Plus, we would be helping you deploy Windows Virtual Desktop for free. So it will be me or one of my colleagues who will jump onto the call help you set up the entire Windows virtual desktop. So it's not just giving you credits and letting you deploy it by yourself. We will handhold you with respect to Windows virtual desktop deployment as well. Just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. So the storage account gets created. If I go to the resource, as you can see, I can create file shares, tables, queues, and containers, right? So in our scenario, we would want to choose file shares. I'll create a new file share. I'll again give it a name saying WVD S2 demo. And now the quota which you give, this needs to be calculated. You need to have an idea in terms of how much does your user profile in total contribute to the storage, right? So if you have, let's say 25 users, how much does each user store in his user profile, right? So let's say 10 GB or 15 GB or 20 GB. So 20 GB into 25 users, that's the quota. I would say give it 30% more than that so that you can have a little more flexibility in terms of the quota here. So in my demo, I'll just give it 128. Now the file share is created. Okay. Now, one of the things to remember is this storage account, though it is part of the same resource group, how can a user get permissions for this particular file storage, right? Because at the end of the day, he's storing his user profile data, which means he needs to have permissions on this file share in order to do that. Now, previously, in order to give access to a file share, permissions for the user, you had to run PowerShell commands and scripts. Microsoft has now made it a little easier. So go back to your storage account, go to the configuration of it, and here you have something called as identity-based access for file shares, right? So here you see Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Now, very soon you will be able to give access to file share via a typical Active Directory. You don't need to have domain services, but this particular feature is still in preview, right? Hopefully another 3 to 6 months, this feature will be available. But for our demo, we'll enable this so that users who are part of our domain services can now access the file share. I'll hit save. Okay, wonderful. And now if I go to access control, you will see certain special roles that get enabled due to this, right? So I'll say add role assignment, and the role which you will see here is this one, storage file data SMB share elevated contributor. Now if I hover over the information button, you will see you will be able to read and modify NTFS permissions, right? So this is what we need, because you should have read and write access or full control on this file share. So I'll select that. I'll choose our Azure AD administrator, and I'll also use WVD users because all the users are part of this particular group, right? There's also another permission that you'll have to give, which is contributor. So we saw elevated contributor. We also need to make sure that they have access as a contributor also. So both these permissions have to be given for the users. Wonderful. So once you have given permission at a storage account level, this permission gets inherited onto the file share as well. So if I go ahead into the file share, and if I look at access control here, you will see that the permissions, if I go to role assignments, the permissions are inherited, right? So give it at the root level and the permissions get inherited. Here, what I'll do is I'll click on connect. Now I've created a file share. I should know how to connect to this file share, right? So if you click on connect, it'll actually give you options in terms of PowerShell scripts. If it's Windows, if it's Linux, it'll give you a bash command. If it's Mac OS also, I think it'll give you a bash command, right? So you just copy it and run it on the Windows machine on the session host. In our scenario, you need to run this on the session host so that it becomes available to all the users, right? So in our demo, the session host is still getting provisioned. So just keeping time frame in mind, I've already created a session host called as ADDS Desktop 0, right? Now, when you create an host pool, you cannot log into the host pool directly. because it doesn't get a public IP address, right? And this is one of the good features of Windows Virtual Desktop. You do not need to open any public IP. You do not need to expose it to the public in order to log in and make use of it, right? But that also gives a constraint for administrators in terms of, okay, how do they now log in? There are two options. One, you can put in a jump server or a dummy server into the same network and log in via that, or you can use something called as Bastion, right? Now, again, I'll not go into the details of Bastion. It's a service that lets you log into machines which are not exposed to public internet. Okay. In my demo, I have created a jump box that's just easy for me. So this is the jump server, which is part of the same network. If I go to IP config, you would see it as part of 10.0.1.6, and my host pool is running on 10.0.1.7, right? I log in as Iron Man again because he has the administrator permissions. Okay. And what I've also done is I've gone ahead. Oh, sorry, this is my laptop. I'll go ahead and mount the user profile data here, the file storage, right? So let me copy. I hope I'm not confusing everybody too much. This definitely involves a lot of steps in terms of the demo. So I'll go back, copy the connect, just copy this to my clipboard. So it creates a shared drive with a drive letter Z. So this is my Windows Virtual Desktop session. I'll open PowerShell here. And just paste it and just run this. Okay. So I should be able to see my drive. As you can see it, now I'm able to access it. So this is as simple as a network share. I can go ahead, create a new folder, create a new file, and this gets replicated back instantaneously. So I've created a folder called test. If I come back here, hit refresh, you will see the test folder also created, right? So it's pretty seamless, pretty straightforward. If I delete it, it should also get deleted here as well, right? So once this is done, you'll have to give permissions on the file share now. So going to the permissions, edit, add. Now only if you have configured or only if you have enabled domain services for this file share, you will be able to add users and give them permissions here, right? If you have not configured that steps, you will not be able to go ahead and configure users and give them permissions over here, right? As you can see, I'm able to look into cloudme.live, which is my entire domain. And here I can resolve my users, right? So I'll users, I'll give them full control, hit apply. Okay. So now all my users who would use Windows Virtual Desktop part of my setup, which is domain services and file share, can start storing their user profile data onto this file storage, right? The only next thing to remaining is go ahead and configure FSLogic, right? I've already downloaded FSLogic on this machine. Go to the release 64 and run your FSLogic apps setup, right? It's a very simple, straightforward setup, except the EULA and the application gets installed, right? Now, once it is installed, what's the next thing? You have to update your registry settings. So I open, so I've already pre-configured some of the values here. So typically you only need two values. One is, so I'll just go back and show you where exactly you need to create this. So go to your local machine, go to software and go to FSLogic. Now under this, you'll need to first create a new key, right? You'll need to create a new key, and the key name is profiles with an S, right? And P has to be capital, right? So you have to follow exact to the letter in terms of editing your registry settings. Once created, the two keys is enabled and VHD locations, right? So under enabled, you make it as 1, and under VHD locations, I'll just change this value to WVDS2 demo. I'll just reconfirm if it is correct. Okay. So I'll just reconfirm one more time. Just give me a second here, because if I put in the wrong one, the user profiles will not get saved. Yeah, on WVDS2 demo. Okay. I usually add this third one because during testing, what I do is I log into the virtual machine a lot of times to check everything is in place. And sometimes I log in before FS Logic gets configured, right? So what happens is the local profile gets created on the machine. When you add this particular key, delete local profile when VHD should apply, the local profile gets deleted automatically and all the data goes onto my FS Logic container. So here the first one is not required, but I just add it as for my understanding. Okay, so now everything is ready. You have host, you have storage, you have all the bits and pieces ready with you. The only next thing to do is log in using your client, right? So again, launch your client, subscribe, and let's log in as let's say Hulk. Okay, you should be able to see one or two session hosts if the session was created. Yeah, so as you can see, this is what I had set up earlier. This is one that we actually set up now. So the session host actually got created, but we'll log into the one where FS Logic is configured. So I'll go on to this Windows 10 desktop. And log in here. And if everything is correct, I should be able to log in, and my profile should get onto the Azure file storage. Okay, so as you can see, it is actually loading my profile from FS Logic Apps service. So while it is loading, I'll quickly show you the profile data in my storage, right? So that we can be sure that it is actually coming out from the same storage. Now, back, file, share, files. It's not created. I'm sorry, I went into the wrong one. So it's not yet created. It's still loading up. So once it loads up, you should be able to log in and start using the Windows 10, and you'll see the user profile created. So this pretty much brings us to the end of today's session, right? So I'm sure it was a very long, a lot of demo, a lot of things to configure, but with this setup, you can service model. You have directory as a service, file storage as a service, and you can potentially offer desktop as a service. Everything running out of Azure. A complete 100% cloud-based VDI infrastructure is what you can achieve with domain services and Azure file storage. Okay. So this pretty much brings me to the end of today's session. What I want to do now is jump on to the questions if you have any. and go through the questions. If you do have anything, feel free to post them on the Q&A, and we'll go through these questions one by one. If you don't have, thank you very much for your time for attending this session. Hope it was informative and helpful. If you do have any questions, feel free to get in touch with the Cloud BDMs or with me, and we'll be more than happy to assist you. Thank you very much, and now we'll jump on to the questions and start answering them. Can I share the presentation? Yes, you will receive the presentation very soon. Thank you, Robert, for answering it. If it needs to be off for the users, it's after that. Yes. Craig, the answer is yes. You can join a standard laptop, but the laptop has to be a Windows 10 laptop, right? You can only join a Windows 10 laptop to Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Does the hybrid Azure AD setup write group policy to the cloud? The answer is no, it does not. You have to recreate the user policies. Alex, does the $1,000 offer replace the 30-day offer mentioned last week? No, it's the same offer. What is the recurring cost of Azure Active Directory Domain Services? So it's roughly what I remember is about $110, anywhere from $110 to $120 is what I remember. And this cost covers about 10,000 users, right? So you don't need to worry about the number of users, but yes, it is a recurring cost month on month. If the client has E3 and E5, they can start to use that to configure Windows Virtual Desktop. The answer is yes. I'm assuming it is Microsoft 365 E3 or E5. So with this setup, you don't need an AD or DC. All you need to make sure is the users are created in Azure AD. Right? That's the end goal. Was the recording from last week sent out? I'll double check with our marketing team and let you know. The recording will be published. Thank you. Dominic, I'll definitely check if the presentation or the recording is not sent out. If it is not sent out, just drop me an email. It's published. The recording is published on YouTube, so we'll share you the YouTube link and I'll share the presentation. George, I'll definitely send out all the details. Okay, so that pretty much brings me to the end of the questions. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending the session. Again, hope it was helpful and informative. Please do get in touch with us if you have any questions or if you want to make use of the promotion offer that we're running. Thank you and have a great week ahead.